All right. Well, today we are continuing our time in First Corinthians, and we're to the 7th chapter there. But as we look into First Corinthians, we're going to see some things today which are kind of tough. Some of them are a little awkward to talk about, but it's all very useful to us. If you can, think back for a moment to what it was like to be in junior high or high school. You know that it was kind of an awkward time, and a time when you kind of had to figure out what your place in the world was. And for some of us that was easy. Maybe we were a star athlete or something, but for others of us it was much more difficult, and you weren't sure where you were supposed to be, and once you did kind of find your spot, you weren't so certain that you wanted to be on the debate club part of the school. You might rather have been the league quarterback or something like that. But finding our place is always kind of a difficult thing. Well, today we're going to talk about things that cover a variety of different people in the body of Christ. People who are married and not married and divorced and all different kinds of things. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, where is my place? Well, hopefully you can take some comfort from this today, but also hopefully this is very instructive to you, and you might take something away from this that helps you know how you ought to live, do what you do. But we're going to begin there in 1 Corinthians 7:1. So I think I already let you know, so maybe we're turned there already, which is great. Okay, now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry. It's kind of a strange opening here. All right, a little bit of background. 1 Corinthians is, of course, 1 Corinthians, which gives way to 2 Corinthians. We know Paul wrote a couple letters to the Corinthians, and in fact, he probably wrote at least 4. We've got a couple of them in our Bible, but this here lets us know that he wasn't the only one writing. The believers there in Corinth had also written a letter to Paul, and it seemed that they were a bit confused. There was a little bit of a difference of opinion. Well, we know from the preceding chapters, looked there a couple weeks ago at 1 Corinthians 6, and it talked about some of the problems with sexual immorality in the church and different things like that. So we know that there was a good bit of that going on, but now we see here there was also this other idea that sex was a bad thing, and that people ought not to get married because that was all just a mess and they didn't want to deal with it. So there's a lot of confusion. So we see that there's kind of a break in the book here. At chapter 7, we see that Paul slows down and starts to teach them very specifically on what they should do. Before this, he's been talking a lot about the things that have been going on in the church, but he gives them some clear instruction here. And so we'll continue on there at verse 2. But since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. Well, it sounds, if you read that straightforward, it sounds like, okay, I'm commanding you all to get married, which is not at all what he's saying. But we'll see that as we get deeper into it. But it has everything to do with the fact that there's so much immorality. We see here Paul is teaching them about how they can best glorify and serve God, and here, obviously, living in immorality is not a good way of doing that. But we continue here, and this message is primarily to the married people within that church there, and by extension to us here. Continuing on at verse 3, the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but to his wife. This is a very non-American sort of sounding section here, and it's a little awkward to talk about. But that being said, it's in the Word of God here, and it's very profitable for us. This section here talks about the marriage within a Christian marriage. Obviously, the physical component of a marriage is an important part. And there is a duty with the husband and the wife to one another to help them to meet those needs they have without going about it in an immoral way. We've seen to this point so far that he's been talking about sexual immorality. That is something that keeps us from serving God in a good way. But the husband and the wife have that provision in marriage to meet their sexual needs with one another. We continue on there at verse 5. Do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Not usually why people take a break from things to devote themselves to prayer, but if that is why you're taking a break from that in your marriage, well, then that is all good and well, and that is a reason that Paul spells out here that would be quite acceptable. But other than that reason, you ought not to deprive each other of that part of marriage. I'll just say that. Yeah, it's a little giggles around the room and so on. It's always nice, and I'm sure people are elbowing each other or whatever. But it's just all right here, black and white, very clear from Scripture. But he continues on, then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So now he's saying why that is. You don't deprive each other because you don't want each other to fall into temptation and to be snared by the devil because of who you run into or meet or see or see pictures of on the magazine rack or on the internet or whatnot. The way that we have as believers of preserving ourselves from that is sex within the marriage. And so for those who have that burning need, and that's a lot of people, marriage there is a concession for that. So continuing on there in verse 6, I say this as a concession, not as a command. So what's not a command here? I wish that all men were as I am, but each man has his own gift from God. One has this and another has that. Okay, so what he's not commanding here is what it sounded like he might have been commanding there in verse 2. He's not commanding that everybody has to be married. If that helps you and allows you not to live in a state of constant temptation that you can't control in your life, then marriage is a great option for you. But Paul is very much of the personal opinion here that singleness can be of a much greater benefit if you're able to exercise that self-control. So here we see that marriage is a great thing, singleness is a great thing. They're great for different reasons. And he'll continue to teach on this. So there in verse 8, now to the unmarried and the widow I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am. So again, he's talking about the benefits of being single there. And this is even to the widow, the person who has been married before. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So, marriage is definitely given here as an option, and a far greater option if you're tempted than to be single. But if you are able to control it, singleness is a good thing. So, obviously, not a passage you hear talked about very often because it is rather awkward, and so people kind of glance over it. But this is straightforward teaching, and if you are a married person, it is important that you understand the duty you have to your spouse, but it is also important that we all see that we can serve God from the position of being married or from being single. So that pretty well encompasses all of us. So, to the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. So here we have a very clear black and white command from God, a command that is just echoed from the Old Testament. It is a command that has been in place for a long time. Do not be divorced. There is provision for divorce in the Old Testament. Moses gave provision for divorce, but even then it was because of the hardness of people's hearts. Divorce is something God hates and that God does not want in our lives. It comes with a lot of consequences, and I'm sure there's divorced people in this room. And that being said, even from the position of being divorced, you can serve and be useful to God. This is not saying that you're done forever once you're divorced. And honestly, there are those ideas out there floating around in some churches that once you are divorced, you are not worthwhile anymore. It is not God's desire that we be divorced, but Paul's not done talking about the topic. So, to the rest I say this, I not the Lord. So this is Paul's teaching. It's not God's saying it is so, but even then, it's made it into Scripture. It is Paul, an apostle's teaching here. I think we ought to listen to what he has to say. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. Okay, so we have the situation within the Corinthian church. This letter is written very specifically to the church at Corinth, where a lot of the people found themselves married to an unbeliever. We hear, some of us as Christians, we're like second, third generation Christians. That's not all of us, but in many cases we're also married to a second or third generation Christian. And we got married when we were believers or whatnot, but this is early days of the church. A lot of the people that are reading this letter or are having this letter read to them are in a situation where they came to the Lord and they were already married. And they were married to a pagan person, just like when they before they came to the Lord, they were likely a pagan person themselves. And they're like, okay, now what do I do? I'm married. I know God doesn't want me to divorce, but also God doesn't want me to be married to an unbeliever. And so what do I do? And there is that idea out there that if I'm a believer and I'm married to an unbeliever, this is a situation I need to get out of. This is not a good situation. I know God doesn't want me to be married to an unbeliever. Well, Paul pretty clearly teaches on that. If you are married to an unbeliever, stay married to them. he's not advocating going out and getting married to an unbeliever, but if you are married to them and you are a Christian, stay married to them. And it continues on here at verse 14. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean. As it is, they are holy. The reasoning here that he gives is the children. It's, the marriage, you want to continue to be an influence in your children's lives and to be able to have influence in their life. And obviously a divorce, whether even with the children living with you, that kind of damages that. That's not the only reason he's going to give here, but he does tell them, you ought to stay married to the unbeliever if you are already married to them. But then he continues on, but if the unbeliever leaves, and this is in verse 15, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. So on our part, as Christians, if we find ourselves married to an unbeliever, we're not supposed to up and leave the other person because they're an unbeliever. And in fact, but if they leave, that's all right. We see that provision here. But that's not saying either that we ought to, just kind of live with them and not maintain the marriage either. If the person is an unbeliever, or even if they're living like they're an unbeliever, and we're not to drive them away or to create the sort of unhospitable environment to where, okay, well, I see there's this provision. If they leave, I'm okay. Well, we're not supposed to hurry that along, but in the situation we're in, we're supposed to live at peace. And it gives this other note at verse 16. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? This is, I think, the great hope of a believing person who is married to an unbeliever, is that if their spouse is unbelieving, that they will come to the point where they know Jesus is their Lord. It is a scary thing to have loved ones not know the Lord. I know people in my family who don't. I've not been married to an unbeliever. Rachel and I were both believers when we got married, but it would be a horrifying thought for me if Rachel were to not be a believer, because I know what the end situation is for an unbeliever. There is that hope for a believer who is married to an unbeliever, that through the words that you say to them and the influence you have living life in front of them, that God will use that to bring them to a saving knowledge of Christ. What this is not saying, on the other hand, is that you ought to just go marry whomever you want, believer or unbeliever, and know in the end that they're going to become a believer. That's not what this is saying. This is not advocating missionary dating or missionary marriages to where you're going to marry this unbelieving person in hopes that they're going to come to the Lord because you married them. That's not what this is saying. It is saying that if you do find yourself in that situation where you are married to an unbeliever, continue to be married to them, continue to try to be an influence for Christ in their life. So, we're talking about some kind of heavy stuff here and kind of awkward stuff, but I'm sure I've spoken to most people in the room by now. Whether you're single, married, or divorced, I think that pretty well covers everybody. But he's got more to say here. There in verse 17, Nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned to him, in which God has called him. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. So, what he's saying here is wherever you are in life, then live there. Be there. Serve God from where you're at. He's talking to a lot of people who got saved while they were already married to an unbeliever, or whether they were single. And he's saying to each one of them in their situation that you're all right where you're at. You can still serve God. You can still be a part of the family of God right where you're at. You know, going back to that example of junior high or high school, just because you're on the chess club and not on the football team doesn't mean you're not a part of the school. You know, just because you happen to be a single person or a divorced person or a person who's married to an unbeliever doesn't mean that you're not a part of the family of God. You've got your place. You can serve God right where you're at. You can find some peace and contentment in that. So he continues on, and he also talks to some other issues that are maybe a little less pertinent to us, but were very pertinent at the time that they were written. And who knows, maybe this really speaks to you. So continuing there at verse 18, was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Not that he probably could, and then he continues, he should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he's called? He should not be circumcised. Obviously, this touches more on a situation where was he, this usually breaks down into, was he Jewish when he was saved? Was he not Jewish? He continues on and clears this right up. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's command is what counts. So whether you were born from a Jewish background or whether you weren't, we can all serve God. We can serve God whether we're married, unmarried, Jew, Roman, or American. We can serve God right from where we're at. And he continues on here. Each one should remain in the situation which he was in when God called him. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain freedom, do so. Obviously, there were a lot more slaves at the time he was writing, and it was different than what we think of as slavery, the American situation of slavery, which was a far uglier thing than what he was dealing with at that time. But he's not advocating slavery, but he's saying that if you do find yourself in that situation, that even you are in a place where you can serve God right from where you're at, that you can please God even as a slave. For he who was a slave when he was called by the Lord is the Lord's freedman. Similarly, he who was a free man when he was called is Christ's slave. And aren't we all? I mean, slave or free, we're all called to be the servants, the slaves of Christ. You are bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men, brothers. Each man, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation God has called him to. And this obviously can apply to a larger group of situations than I can talk to here. But whatever situation you're in, you think your situation bars you from serving God, I can tell you here, it doesn't. God can use you in the situation you're in. He doesn't expect you if you've really messed up and gotten yourself to a bad place. He expects us to continually live more and more like Christ and to strive to be more like Christ but even then, right where you're at today, even if you've messed up, even if you were born into your situation, he can use you right where you're at. And he continues on there in verse 25. Now about virgins I have no command from the Lord, but I give judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. This is a little, it reads a little weird to us. Virgins are assumed to be unmarried persons. Some translations actually translate it to unmarried, but the idea is that then, a virgin was an unmarried person. And Paul himself was unmarried at this time. There is some evidence that he was maybe married at some time, but when he came to Christ, that his family left him, but that is somewhat speculation. There in 26, because of this present crisis, I think that it is good that you remain as you are. He's saying that it's good to remain single, but he's saying it in the light of the situation that the Corinthian believers found themselves in. They were living in a day with persecution of Christians, some rather hard situations, and he's speaking to that situation. In this tough situation, you're probably better off staying single. We are not necessarily in the crisis situation that the Corinthian church found themselves in. Obviously, we could find ourselves in that situation sometime within our lifetime, but just understand where Paul's writing from. Are you married? Do not seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. Well, he's talking about marriage and making it sound pretty rough here. Obviously, within a persecuted church sort of background, there's certainly some tough things that would have come along with that. But even in marriage today, marriage can be tough. Marriage can be very hard. You do not control the other one's actions. Maybe your music tastes aren't what theirs are, and you have the daily battle in the car over the radio dial, or maybe your wife likes it to be cold enough to hang beef in your room, and maybe you like it nice and toasty. Who knows? But these are the little things that are a challenge in life. Some of the challenges that marriage brings, and sometimes those challenges are far greater than a room temperature or what's going to play on the radio. When it comes to your beliefs or how you're going to raise your children, are the kids going to be schooled at home, or are they going to a Christian school, or are they going to public school, or are you going to, how are you going to discipline your children? Even two Christian parents might have widely different ideas on Christianity and how you're going to teach your children as they grow. There are challenges that come along with marriage. Paul wanted to spare the believers there some of the challenges that come along with that, but even that, the challenges don't diminish that marriage can be a good thing too. He continues on there, verse 29. What I mean, brothers, is that time is short. And he'll continue on here. We do have a relatively short time, and that time ought to be spent in service to God. And this is one of the bigger challenges that marriage poses. He'll continue on here. From now on, those who have wives should live as they had none, those who mourn as if they had not, those who are happy as if they were not, those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep, those who use the things of this world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. Time is short. We only have so much time, and we only have so much time to serve God. And so, even for the married person, married life does take time. You spend time with one another. You spend time with your children. The married person has less time to spend, serving God very specifically. But so does the person who is, entrapped in the things of this world. They are serving those things rather than God. The person who is worried about being happy or being liked, God ought to be our first priority, even for the married, the unmarried, and it's easy to let other things take the first place in our lives. Really, he's talking very seriously here about how do we best serve the Lord. He'll talk here about the married versus single thing some more in 32. I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. So that's a good thing. That's a good thing about singleness. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. Well, that is certainly true. If you are married, well, on some level, you ought to be worried about what your spouse wants, and you ought to, you are commanded to love them, and part of that is spending time with them, letting them know they are loved, and that does take time, but our service to God ought to be first. So even then, as we look at the married couple, the two married people ought to both be loving one another, but primarily they should be loving God first. And that's how marriage works the best. So then he continues on, and an unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. So, other side of the same coin here. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way that is undivided, in undivided devotion to the Lord. His primary goal here for the married person and the single person and the divorced person is that they be serving God first. Being married is good. If you struggle with temptations, physical temptations, it's very good that it's very clear from the passage we've read here, but you do have a somewhat divided devotion to God. The single person, that is not a deal there, but they can even have divided devotion to God. It is important that we be, all of us, devoted to God. Verse 36 there, he continues, if anyone thinks he is acting improperly toward the virgin he is engaged to, and if she is getting along in years and he feels he ought to marry her, he should do as he wants. He is not sinning. They should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. So he who marries the virgin does the right thing, but he who does not marry her does even better. So he's saying, hey, if you got these desires, go ahead and get married, but if you don't, that's great too. You're all doing all right. You're all going to be good as long as you put God first. So he's talking about some tough things here, and we continue to look at this here in just a couple more verses. There at verse 39, a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to marry anyone she wishes. But he must belong to the Lord. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is, but I think that I too have the Spirit of God. So he's saying here, singleness is fantastic, that a person can live in devotion to God, but if you get married, that's not a sin. In fact, that can be the right thing for you. It can be something that helps preserve you from temptation. But for the single person, they too can serve God. So serving God is a key focus here. We look back at verse 17. And it kind of sums up the idea of this passage. Nevertheless, each one should retain the place in his life that the Lord assigned to him, to which God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. So right where you're at, you can serve God. If you want to get married, that's great. Just make sure it's a believer. He does make that command very clear. If you want to stay single, that's great too. You can serve God right from where you're at. There's a good deal of things to think about in this passage. We should think about service to God first and how being married or not being married, either one of those can be the way in which we can best serve God. Back to the kind of school example there. If everybody was the captain of the debate team, that wouldn't work, but everybody can't be the head cheerleader either. Right where you're at, they're all part of the same school, right where all of you are at, whether you are that divorced person, whether you are the married person, whether you are a single person, you can serve God right from where you're at and not have to feel awkward about it. You fit right where you're at. You're right where God wants you. So I hope you can take some comfort from this and take some instruction from what God teaches here. And let's close in a word of prayer.